Have you ever thought about this? Giant creatures really shouldn't exist from a biological point of view, because in nature, every extra centimeter of size is a brutal battle against gravity, heat dissipation, and circulation. Yet even so, humans are still obsessed with the limits of size. We always want to know, just how big can life get? Is there an upper limit that can never be broken? The answer is yes. Actually, there's more than one. We'll talk about them later, but the most direct and deadly one is mass. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with Godzilla. Back then, I thought the reason there weren't more giant creatures was simply because nature was too cowardly. Later, I finally understood. If you simply scale up an existing animal in proportion, it probably wouldn't become a monster. It would physically collapse. Behind this lies a brutal rule called the square-cube law. Simply put, volume always increases faster than surface area, and that creates huge problems. For example, imagine your skin area increased 13 times. Sounds like a lot, right? But that's the elephant's reality. Its surface area is about 13 times that of a human, but its volume is nearly 60 times. In other words, that extra skin is nowhere near enough. And skin is a major way animals release heat. That's why elephants love soaking in water, why they have huge ears, not for looks, but to dump as much heat as possible. The bigger you are, temperature problems don't just grow linearly, they get exponentially worse. The bigger you are, the more it's like you're slowly being roasted by physics itself. But heat isn't the scariest part. The real danger is bones. Every creature ultimately relies on its skeleton for support. Small animals can get by with relatively thin bones, but once size increases, bones must get thicker and heavier. Eventually, math just says no. Even large hollow-boned sauropods could barely survive near their livets. Some research suggests that when body weight reaches around 120 tons, their leg bones would need to be so thick to avoid crushing that they wouldn't even be able to take a single step. That's the hard ceiling of life's size limit, at least on land. Of course, we'll later explore whether there are ways around this limit. But honestly, when I was younger, I didn't really believe these limits existed, partly because I desperately wanted giants to be real, and any limitation felt like an insult to imagination. And partly because whenever I looked at skyscrapers or the horizon, I always felt like some colossal being might be hiding just beyond sight, like the ghost of something that once existed. And to be fair, Earth did have truly gigantic land animals. Paleontologists have long obsessed over one question: who was the biggest dinosaur ever? We're always drawn to those that push the limits. So let's try this. What if a sauropod evolved to live almost half aquatic? If walking wasn't its main survival need, could it approach the theoretical maximum size of a land creature? I don't really have artistic talent, but I do have drawing software and imagination. You can think of this as nature's closest version of a movie monster. But even then, once it neared 120 tons, it probably would have to stay in water most of the time. This leads to something crucial. Throughout history, creatures larger than sauropods mostly lived in the ocean. Water's buoyancy and cooling effect means marine life isn't bound by land's restrictions. So if any life form is going to break records, it's likely something in the sea. But even there, the problem doesn't end. For whales and extinct marine giants, the truly deadly limit isn't weight, it's food.
Sailors can usually only catch a brief glimpse of their backs on the ocean's surface, or find scattered giant remains washed up on the shoreline. Whales are simply too massive to be perceived as a whole. We can only understand them in fragments. And in doing so, their true scale is often severely underestimated. Even today, it's still very hard for humans to truly grasp a whale's size through images or videos, Many scientific comparisons about whales instantly shatter people's intuition, forcing them to realize how much they've been underestimating these ocean giants. This doesn't mean it's theoretically impossible to design aquatic life even larger than whales. Although a single solid life form may struggle to exceed some collective life structures in length, when it comes to mass, our more commonly used measure of size, the situation is completely different. If we imagine a perfectly ideal ocean ecosystem with stable, endless food supply, then theoretically creatures far larger than existing whales could exist. The limits they face would mainly come from oxygen circulation and feeding efficiency rather than body size itself. Under those conditions, they would truly be the titans of the sea. However, the real issue may not be whether physics allows such beings to exist, but whether humans are capable of understanding them at all. Our flawed perception of scale is one of the greatest barriers we face when imagining the largest forms of life. Even with reference objects present, our brains are easily misled. This is especially clear in visual arts. Even when we know a photo compares a normal-sized object with an oversized one, our brains still instinctively rationalize the image and misjudge the true proportions. The same happens with giant sculptures. Even when we know what we're seeing is distorted in scale, even if we personally watched a giant coin being created, our minds struggle to accept that we aren't looking at a miniature model. Sculptor Robert Therian once created massively enlarged everyday objects like desks and chairs. They are extremely impressive, but without a person standing nearby for comparison, you can barely understand how big they really are. And even when someone is standing there, your brain still develops a strange illusion. The person looks too small, while the furniture somehow still feels normal. Human perception is naturally flawed. Our judgment of scale has systemic biases. That's why the film industry has been able to exploit this weakness for decades, using sets and forced perspective to deceive our senses. A person in a monster suit is, in essence, just human-sized, but once placed inside a tiny model city, it immediately becomes convincing. This internal perceptual error can certainly be entertaining, but it has also seriously misled us in understanding how gigantic some real species truly are. Even when looking at standard size comparison charts, my visual system can't always process the information correctly. Rationally, we know that the tiny human silhouette represents a normal adult, but in reality, our brains almost never calculate proportions accurately. Because of this, we consistently underestimate how truly massive nature can be. Even theoretically, we can imagine life forms larger than blue whales, such as ocean giants that do not swim, but live like enormous seafloor filters. But the real question is whether the human brain can truly comprehend such a scale. In truth, our perception of huge is extremely unreliable. Creatures of the same size may appear shockingly large in some images, yet look ordinary in others, simply depending on whether a reference exists. When a giant creature only ever appears alongside an equally giant environment or organisms, its size becomes drastically underestimated, not because it isn't big, but because proportion stops working. This also explains a long-standing problem. Humans are bad at intuitively understanding extreme scales. Our perception repeatedly causes us to underestimate true enormity. Movies often feature creatures supposedly far larger than whales, like alien megafauna in science fiction, yet they rarely feel that exaggerated when seen on screen. This isn't the film's fault. It's because our brains simply aren't designed to handle extreme scales. Usually, these giant beings only interact with other equally enormous characters who are already far larger than humans. This constantly distorts the audience's sense of proportion. Measurement makes size truly concrete. Someone once measured a blue whale's full length in the simplest possible way, about 34 meters, using huge quantities of yarn, extending it section by section. The yarn became so long it was impossible to control, forming a twisted, tangled serpent of thread that couldn't be fully laid out in ordinary spaces. Only in an open forest clearing could the entire length be stretched out, and in that moment, size stopped being just a concept. As your eyes followed the yarn extending endlessly forward, you truly felt the overwhelming magnitude and oppressive presence you couldn't ignore. It evoked thoughts of the deep sea, darkness, and some vast, unseen being lurking in an unknowable space, instinctively triggering unease. This reaction isn't strange. Humans naturally feel both awe and fear towards extremely massive life, shocked by their scale, yet instinctively sensing danger. In reality, we already have life forms close to this kind of experience. For example, the underground fungal network in North America, covering over 2,000 acres. It doesn't appear on the surface, but sprawls beneath the earth like a limitless web, covering the equivalent of thousands of football fields, and possibly being the largest single organism on Earth. Another example are massive forests of aspen trees. They appear to be countless individual trees, yet underground they share a single root system, meaning biologically they are a single organism. If we expand scale further, a life form spread across an entire planet is theoretically possible. Planetary fungal networks or supercollectives of countless individuals may represent the limit of life's maximum scale, but this answer always feels like it lacks something. If we break the rules further, the problem is no longer just size, but structure. Land animals are generally thought to be limited at around 120 tons, primarily because of the load-bearing capacity of their limb bones. But this assumes they only have 4 legs. If a creature evolved far more limbs, or a completely different skeletal system, could that limit increase? We don't know, because all large vertebrates on Earth evolved from the same 4-limbed ancestor. Beyond structure, the limitations of life scale come from material strength. Just as humans can build skyscrapers with steel, if life evolved biological materials with far greater strength, weight limits could be rewritten. And if we chase the absolute extreme of scale, we must leave the ground entirely, because in space, gravity no longer restricts size. The vacuum of space is extreme, but not necessarily inhabitable. With the right outer shell, structure, and energy acquisition system, life wouldn't need to depend on a planet at all. One concept imagines a protected core body surrounded by biological solar sails, able to absorb starlight for energy while using solar radiation for propulsion. In such a form, life would no longer be restricted by gravity and energy in the same way. Theoretically, this might be the largest possible form of life we can imagine. But the question is never just, can it be bigger? Because each time scale reaches the extreme, human cognition collapses first. In fact, compared with most life on Earth, humans are giants already, and within us live imaginably tiny organisms. Scale is always relative. When the frame of reference changes, huge loses meaning. Maybe the reason we keep searching for the ultimate giant isn't because nature hasn't given enough, but because we've always been viewing the world from the wrong perspective.